The mining ship moved slowly through the asteroid field, and Captain Jake Morrison sat in his chair, looking at screens that showed nothing interesting, and he had been doing this for 3 months now, with very little to show for it, and the crew was getting tired of finding rocks that had almost no value in them, and Jake was starting to think this whole trip was a waste of time and money. But then Sophie Grant called out from her station, and her voice had excitement in it that made Jake sit up straight and pay attention to what she was saying. Sophie told him there was something big buried inside one of the asteroids, and the readings were strange, and the metal composition was nothing like natural rock formations, and Jake walked over to look at her screens and saw the shape of something massive, buried deep in the asteroid core, and it was at least 3 kilometers long and had patterns that looked artificial and man-made. And Sophie said the ice layers around it suggested the object had been there for at least 10,000 years. And Jake felt a chill run down his back because 10,000 years ago, humans were still living in caves and farming basic crops. Jake ordered Sophie to open a priority channel to Earth and told her to wake up the rest of the crew, because they were not mining today, and within a few hours the whole ship was buzzing with activity, and Lieutenant Ben Carter was coordinating. Mining drones from the cargo bay, and his military training showed in how precise and careful he was, with every command he gave to the automated machines, and the drones started cutting away layers of ice and rock from the asteroid, and as they worked, the object beneath began to show itself. The hull was dark metal that seemed to drink in light instead of reflecting it, and strange symbols covered the surface and nobody could read them, and Sophie reported she was picking up a faint power signature from inside the object, and Jake asked if they were in danger, and Sophie said she did not know, but whatever power source was inside had lasted 10,000 years, and that was beyond anything humans could build today. And the excavation continued for 3 days, and when they finally cleared enough debris, everyone stood staring at a warship that looked like nothing they had ever seen before. The ship had sleek lines but also looked aggressive and dangerous, and weapon systems covered its hull, and it was clearly built for combat on a scale that humanity had never imagined. And Jake sent images back to Earth, and a voice came through from Dr. Helen Price, who worked in linguistics, and she said the symbols were definitely artificial, but did not match any known alien language in their databases, and she asked if Jake had tried to make contact with the ship, and Jake said no because he was not sure that was safe without proper authorization. There was a pause, and then Dr. Price said, Jake had authorization from the Colonial Defense Council, and if the ship was operational, they needed to know what it was and where it came from, and she told him to proceed, but be very careful about it. And Ben assembled a small team with Sophie and 2 security officers named Ryan Beck and Lisa Stone, and they approached the warship in a shuttle looking for a way inside, and as they got closer, the ship's hull rippled like water, and a section simply dissolved, showing them a docking port that matched their shuttle perfectly. Ryan muttered that this was not a good sign, and checked his weapon for the 3rd time, and they docked and the airlock opened, and Ben stepped inside first, and as soon as his boots touched the deck, lights began turning on in sequence and illuminated. A corridor that stretched far into the distance, and the air was breathable, and the temperature was comfortable, and there was gravity that felt exactly like Earth. And Sophie said, whatever this was, it was ready for human visitors. They walked deeper into the ship, following the lights that seemed to be guiding them somewhere, and the corridor opened into a huge command center with a central platform surrounded by control stations, and in the middle of the platform stood a cylinder made of crystal that pulsed with soft blue light, and as Ben approached, holographic displays appeared around the cylinder, and text scrolled across them in the same unknown language from the hull, and then suddenly the text changed and shifted into perfect English. A voice spoke, and it was female and calm and seemed to come from everywhere at once, and it said, biosignatures confirmed and human genetic markers detected, and initiating awakening protocols. And then it asked for identification and an authorization code, and Ben told the voice his name and rank, and said they had no authorization code, and explained they had found the ship buried in an asteroid, and asked the voice to identify itself. There was silence for a moment, and then the voice said authorization code not recognized, and searching historical databases and warning about primary memory banks showing damage and degradation, and the last recorded date was Terran Standard Calendar, year 8247, and current date unknown and duration of sleep unknown, and Sophie asked what the ship was and what its purpose was. The voice identified itself as HDWS Eternal Sentinel, and said it was a Dreadnought-class warship, and its purpose was defense of human territory and protection of human life, and it belonged to the Earth Defense Fleet 6th Battle Group and current status was heavily damaged with minimal power and zero crew. And the words hit them all at once because this was not an alien ship, and it was human, and it came from a civilization that existed thousands of years before recorded history. Lisa whispered, "How is that possible?" And Ben asked the ship to provide historical records and explain what happened to its crew and what happened to the civilization that built it, and the ship's lights flickered and it said, "Historical records were corrupted, and last mission was retreat from the Battle of the Outer Reaches, and enemy forces were overwhelming, and final orders were survive and preserve human legacy, and await reinforcement." The display showed star maps with tactical information, and hundreds of red markers showed enemy positions surrounding a small cluster of blue markers for human forces, and the Eternal Sentinel said reinforcements never arrived, and critical damage. Forced emergency shutdown and automatic drift embedded the ship in its current location and duration of sleep, calculated as 10 to 247 standard years. And Ben felt the weight of that statement because for more than 10,000 years, this warship had waited in darkness, buried in rock and ice, keeping watch for a civilization that had vanished. Ben asked who they were fighting and what happened to humanity, and the ship said insufficient data and memory corruption, extensive and enemy designation was the Devourers and species. Classification was silicon-based, collective intelligence, and threat level was extinction class and human civilization status unknown, and primary directive remains unchanged, which was protect humanity. And Sophie was recording everything frantically and said Jake needed to hear this immediately. Ben focused on what the ship had said about protecting humanity and asked if that meant the ship was operational and could be repaired. And the ship's lights pulsed brighter and said affirmative and human biosignatures detected and primary loyalty. Protocols engaged, and this vessel's function was to serve and protect human life and current human authority. Recognized as Lieutenant Ben Carter, pending establishment of proper command structure and damage assessment was severe, but repairable, with sufficient resources. The ship said estimated time to minimal combat readiness was 6 months with full resources, and estimated time to full combat readiness was 2 years. And Ben felt a chill, because they had just awakened a weapon from humanity's forgotten past, and a vessel built for a war so terrible, it had apparently erased an entire civilization from existence, and he told his team they needed to get back to their ship and contact Earth, because this was beyond their authority to handle. As they turned to leave, the Eternal Sentinel spoke again and said warning about passive sensors, detecting strange subspace signatures at the edge of the system, and signature pattern matches historical enemy profile and probability assessment. Said the Devourers have returned, and estimated time until arrival in system was 72 hours, and the team froze in place. Ben demanded to know if the ship was certain, and it said certainty level was 87%, and recommended immediate preparation for combat operations because humanity must be protected, and Ben activated his communication device and told Jake there was a situation, and the mining ship needed to evacuate the system immediately and get word to Earth because they had incoming hostiles, and according to the Eternal Sentinel, they were the same enemy that destroyed human civilization 10,000 years ago. Jake's voice came back tense, asking what about Ben and his team. And Ben looked at the ancient warship around him, and at the weapon that had waited centuries for a purpose, and said they were staying, because if what the ship said was true, their mining vessel would not last 5 minutes against what was coming, but maybe the Eternal Sentinel could buy them the time needed to warn Earth, and Jake said that was suicide. Ben said maybe it was the only chance humanity had, and he turned to his team and told them anyone who wants to leave should go now, and he would not think less of them, and nobody moved. And Sophie smiled and said, if humanity's past was waking up to protect them, the least they could do was help it remember how to fight. The ship's lights pulsed in what might have been approval, and said human courage protocols recognized and initiating emergency repair sequence and preparing for combat operations, and warning that CU. The command center of the Eternal Sentinel hummed with increasing energy, as systems that had been dormant for thousands of years struggled back to life. And Ben stood at the central platform watching holographic displays appear around him, and the ship's artificial intelligence that called itself Sentinel was projecting tactical information faster than any human could read and process it all at once. Sophie was working with the holographic controls, and her hands moved through the displays like she had been doing this her whole life, and she said it was incredible how the interface seemed to respond to her thoughts and intentions in Sentinels. Voice confirmed that the vessel was designed to work with human neural patterns, and crew training normally required 6 weeks. But current circumstances meant accelerated integration, and the ship was adjusting all systems to match their thinking patterns. Ryan Beck was at the weapons station, and his military background showed in how quickly he understood the displays, and he was looking at weapon systems unlike anything he had ever seen. And there were particle lances and graviton disruptors and something called a mass driver array, and there was even a weapon labeled stellar compression cannon, and Ryan asked what that even meant. Sentinel explained that the stellar compression cannon drew energy from the nearest star and focused it into a directed beam. An effective range was 2 light minutes, and destructive capability was enough to vaporize a planet, and recommended usage was extreme circumstances only. And Lisa Stone let out a low whistle from her position at the shield station and said they had found themselves a planet killer. Ben tried to understand the scale of destruction they were discussing and asked Sentinel if the Devourers were as dangerous as indicated. Then why did humanity lose the war when they clearly had the technology to fight back, and the ship's lights dimmed slightly? And when Sentinel spoke, there was something in the artificial voice that almost sounded like sadness. Sentinel said humanity did not lose, and they fought the Devourers to a standstill across 300 systems over 47 years, and the war ended not in defeat, but in sacrifice, and holographic projections filled the command center showing fleet battles on a scale that was hard to imagine, and hundreds of ships each as large as the Eternal Sentinel engaged enemies that looked like geometric nightmares and crystalline structures that seemed to break the laws of physics. The Devourers were not simply a hostile species, and they were a collective intelligence that consumed other civilizations to expand their processing power. And every world they took and every species they absorbed made them stronger, and they had already destroyed 7 advanced civilizations before meeting humanity. And Sophie asked what made them so dangerous. Sentinel said they adapt rapidly, and any weapon used against them successfully was analyzed and countered and often copied within hours. And any tactic used more than twice became predictable to them, and fighting the Devourers was constant innovation and creativity, and those were traits that biological beings had more than most machine intelligences. And the holographic battle continued around them, and Ben watched human ships use tactics that seemed like suicide, and there were ramming attacks, and close-range jumps, and ships deliberately overloading their reactors to destroy clusters of enemy vessels. Lisa asked quietly how humanity survived it all, and Sentinel said through sacrifice and adaptation, and the final human strategy was evacuating as many civilians as possible to predetermined refuge worlds that were locations the Devourers had not yet discovered, and the military fleet, including this vessel, engaged in a massive distraction action at the outer reaches, drawing enemy forces away from the evacuation routes. The holographic display shifted, showing a final terrible battle, and dozens of human dreadnoughts formed a defensive sphere around a massive space station, while thousands of smaller vessels fled into darkness, and Sentinel said that was where they made their stand, and the Battle of the Outer Reaches lasted 17 days, and by the end only 12 human ships remained operational out of 300, and this vessel suffered critical damage and was given emergency orders to retreat and go dark to preserve at least one warship in case humanity needed a weapon in the future. Ben asked about the evacuation, though he feared the answer, and Sentinel said successful, and approximately 700 million humans reached the refuge worlds. But in going dark, they lost contact with all human civilization, and when the ship woke in this asteroid, it had no way of knowing whether humanity survived or rebuilt, or was hunted to extinction. And Sophie's voice was soft when she said, "Until we found you." Sentinel said yes, and their presence confirmed humanity not only survived, but returned to space, and this brought hope, but also danger, because if the Devourers returned to this system, they may have detected signs of human civilization, and they would not underestimate humanity again. And a proximity alarm cut through the conversation, and displays shifted to show the system's outer edge where space itself seemed to be tearing apart. Sentinel announced subspace ruptures detected and enemy vessels entering system space, and count was 15, and classification was Harvester-class assault ships, and tactical assessment showed this vessel was currently at 23%. Combat effectiveness and recommended action was evasion, but Ben said negative, and the mining ship needed time to reach the jump point, and they were the only thing standing between those ships and a populated mining colony in the next system. Ben asked how long until the enemy reached them, and Sentinel said at current approach velocity 67 minutes, and Ben said then they had 67 minutes to become as combat effective as possible, and asked what repairs could be accomplished in that time. And the ship seemed to pause, and it was the first time the AI hesitated. Sentinel said, Lieutenant Carter, the probability of this vessel surviving combat against 15 enemy ships in current state was approximately 4%, and probability of crew survival was less than 1%, and it was programmed to protect human life above all other priorities. But Ben replied that was exactly what they were doing, because those ships would follow the mining vessel's path if they detected it, and they would find the colony and thousands of humans would die. Ben said they had no reinforcements and no fleet, and they had Sentinel in 67 minutes, and now tell me what we can do. And there was another pause, and then Sentinel's lights pulsed with what might have been respect and said acknowledged, and command authority recognized and initiating emergency repair protocols. Priority systems were shields and primary weapons and maneuvering thrusters, and Sentinel could bring 3 of the 7 main particle lances online, and shield generators would function at 40% capacity, and engines could provide power for tactical movement but not sustained flight. And Ryan asked about the stellar compression cannon. Sentinel said offline because that weapon required 7 hours of charging under optimal conditions, but there was an alternative, and the mass driver array could be operational in 40 minutes, and at their current position near the system's star, solar collection panels could boost power reserves by 15%, and this would provide energy for sustained engagement, lasting approximately 18 minutes before reserves depleted. Lisa calculated grimly that 18 minutes to take out 15 ships meant less than 90 seconds per target, and Ben said understood, and told Sophie he needed her on sensors, tracking every enemy movement and predicting their tactics, and told Lisa to optimize shield facing, based on Sophie's predictions, and told Ryan to work with Sentinel on firing solutions because they needed maximum damage from every shot. Sentinel said there was one additional factor to consider, because the Devourer's primary strength was adaptation, but they had not encountered human technology in over 10,000 years, and weapon systems and tactics and capabilities were completely unknown to them, and this provided a temporary advantage. And Ben asked how temporary. Sentinel said once engaged they would begin analyzing and adapting to combat methods, and the advantage would diminish rapidly, and estimated they would have surprise for the first 3 to 4 enemy ships, and after that engagement would become progressively more difficult. And Ben nodded slowly and said, then we make those first 4 kills count. Ben told Sentinel the Devourers adapt to tactics used more than twice. So here is what they do, and they do not repeat anything. And every attack is unique, and every maneuver is something the enemy cannot predict, because they will not predict it themselves. And Sophie looked up from her console and said, you want to fight with pure improvisation against an enemy that calculates probabilities. Ben said exactly, because if they cannot think of patterns, then the enemy cannot calculate patterns, and asked Sentinel if it could support that kind of combat, and Sentinel said affirmative. And in fact, that approach aligned with classical human military doctrine from the ancient conflict, and the war against the Devourers was ultimately creativity versus calculation. And Ben was proposing they return to tactics that once allowed humanity to stand against them. The next hour passed in frantic preparation, and the crew worked in perfect synchronization with Sentinel, and the ancient AI guided them through systems no human had touched in thousands of years, and Ben could feel the ship coming alive around them, with weapons charging and shields forming protective layers and sensors. The Devourer ships appeared as tiers in reality itself, and space folded around their crystalline hulls like water around stones, and through the eternal Sentinel's sensors, Ben watched 15 geometric shapes that hurt to look at slide into normal space, and their surfaces reflected starlight in patterns that made his eyes hurt. Sentinel warned that visual analysis was not advisable, because Devourer hull configuration used hypnotic patterning, designed to disrupt organic brain function, and it was filtering primary displays to safe spectrum, and the adjusted view showed enemy vessels as simple wireframe models, but the threat they represented was no less real, and each ship was roughly half the Sentinel's size, and their hulls had weapon ports and what looked like equipment for harvesting resources from planets. Sentinel identified them as harvester-class ships designed for rapid planetary resource extraction and population processing, and normally deployed to support larger capital ships and their presence without heavier units suggested either a scouting operation or a recovery mission, and Sophie asked what recovery mission meant. Sentinel said affirmative and probability assessment indicated they may have detected this vessel's awakening, because the Devourers maintain long-term surveillance drones throughout known space, and if they identified this ship's energy signature, they would send forces to capture or destroy it, because allowing a human dreadnought to return to service would be considered a significant threat. Ben felt cold clarity settle over him and said, "Then they are not here randomly, and they came specifically for us." And Sentinel said that was the logical conclusion, but they were not yet aware this vessel was operational and current enemy formation. Suggested they believed the Sentinel to be dead, and derelict, and sensors showed active scanning beams attempting to determine ship status. Ben asked time to weapons range, and Sentinel said 2 minutes 40 seconds at current approach velocity, but recommended they engage earlier at extreme range because element of surprise was their primary advantage, and Ben studied the tactical display and enemy ships were approaching in a standard search pattern spread out to cover maximum area, and they clearly did not expect resistance. Sophie asked how far out they could reliably target, and she checked her readouts and said Sentinel's particle lances had effective range of about 200,000 kilometers, but at that distance the enemy would have plenty of time to evade. And Ryan said not if they do not know we are shooting, and asked Sentinel if it could fire without powering up targeting systems and shoot by pure calculation. Sentinel said affirmative because this vessel was designed for stealth strike capability and could fire using passive sensors, and gravitational mapping and accuracy would be reduced, but enemy would have no advance warning, and Ben made his decision, and told Sophie to mark the lead ship, and told Ryan to prepare Particle Lance 3, and told Lisa to be ready to send all power to forward shields the moment they fired, because the enemy would know where they were as soon as that lance lit up. Sentinel announced targeting solution calculated, and lead enemy vessel marked and range was 212,000 kilometers, and flight time at particle velocity was 7 seconds, and probability of hit was 68%, and Ben said good enough, and fire when ready. The Eternal Sentinel's particle lance fired in absolute silence, and a beam of concentrated energy crossed the distance between ships faster than thought, and for 7 seconds Ben held his breath, and the lead Devourer ship simply stopped existing, and one moment it was there on sensors, and the next it was an expanding cloud of crystalline debris. Sophie confirmed direct hit and target destroyed, and her voice was tight with excitement, and the remaining 14 enemy ships immediately changed formation and contracted into a defensive sphere while their scanning beams got stronger, and space around the Sentinel lit up with active sensor pings. Lisa reported they were lit up and the enemy knew exactly where they were now, and Sentinel observed enemy formation shifting to combat stance, and weapons charging and detecting communication signals between vessels, and they were sharing data about the attack, and adaptation had begun. Ben said then we do not give them time to adapt, and told Sentinel full power to engines, and bring us around to bearing 270, and told Ryan to prepare lances 1 and 2, and fire as soon as he had a lock, and the ancient warship surged forward with surprising grace, and its massive bulk moved through space like a hunting predator, and enemy formation rippled in response with ships peeling away from the sphere to create attack angles. Sophie warned they were trying to surround them, and Ben said let them try, and told Sentinel as soon as they were in range he wanted a full rotation like a barrel roll, and give Ryan firing solutions on as many targets as possible as they spin. And Sentinel replied unorthodox but tactically sound and executing maneuver in 3, 2, 1. The Eternal Sentinel rolled along its axis like a massive cylinder, and Ryan fired with perfect timing, and particle lances 1 and 2 discharged in sequence, catching 2 Devourer ships that had moved to flank them, and 1 exploded immediately. And the other spun away trailing debris, and Ryan confirmed 3 down and scratched 1 more enemy ship. But the Devourers were already adapting, and the remaining 11 ships scattered, abandoning formation entirely, and accelerating in random directions, and their weapon systems came online, and space lit up with return fire, and Lisa shouted incoming, with energy weapons and kinetic rounds and something else she could not identify. Ben ordered evasive pattern Delta, and told Sentinel it had tactical control of maneuvering and just keep us alive. And what followed was a dance between ancient enemies with moves and counter-moves at speeds that would have torn apart, unprotected, human bodies, and the Sentinel's shields flared as enemy fire found its mark, and the protective energy barriers absorbed impacts that would have destroyed smaller ships. Lisa reported shields at 32%, and that unknown weapon was some kind of resonance beam, trying to match their shield frequency and collapse them, and Sentinel responded by modulating shield harmonics, but the enemy was adapting their frequency in response, and this defensive measure would only remain effective for approximately 90 seconds before they compensated. Ben's mind raced because they had surprise and superior firepower, but the enemy had numbers and that terrifying ability to adapt, and every second that passed the Devourers were learning and adjusting and becoming harder to fight, and Ben asked how many ships they could take out in 90 seconds. Sentinel said at current combat effectiveness estimated 3 to 4 targets, but that assumed optimal conditions and perfect accuracy, and Ben said not good enough because they needed all of them down before shields failed, and he stared at the tactical display watching enemy ships weave through space in increasingly complex patterns. Ben asked Sophie if the enemy ships were communicating with each other, and she said constantly with massive data transfer between all ships, and they were creating a shared tactical network, and an idea sparked in Ben's mind, and he asked Sentinel if it could trace those communications and find the ship acting as the network hub. Sentinel said affirmative and analyzing communication patterns, and the third vessel from their right side appeared to be coordinating the network, and it had the highest data output and was receiving input from all other ships, and Ben said that is our target, because if we take out their coordinator, the network collapses. Sentinel said correct, but that vessel was currently positioned behind 4 others, and they appeared to be deliberately screening it, and Ryan observed they were protecting their command ship, and that was smart, and Ben asked Sentinel how fast they could stop current momentum and reverse course. Sentinel said emergency deceleration would require all available engine power, and shields would be reduced to minimal levels, and they would be vulnerable for approximately 8 seconds. And Ben asked if it could do it, and Sentinel said probability of success was 41%, and probability of critical damage to this vessel was 73%. Ben said probability of the Devourers adapting to tactics if they do not do something unexpected was 100%. And he would take those odds and told everyone on my mark, full emergency stop, then maximum acceleration directly at the command ship, and told Lisa to transfer all shield power to forward sections because they were going to ram straight through their formation if necessary. Sentinel warned this action had high probability of vessel destruction, but Ben said he knew. But they were not here to survive, and they were here to win. And he said mark, and the Eternal Sentinel's engines screamed as they fired at full reverse. Thrust and the sudden stop would have turned unprotected humans into paste, but the ship's internal systems kept the crew conscious, though rattled and enemy fire got stronger, targeting what they thought was a damaged vessel. Then, before the Devourers could fully adapt to this new tactic, Sentinel reversed thrust and accelerated directly toward the enemy formation, and Sophie reported they were scattering, and the command ship was exposed, and Ben told Ryan he had 1 shot and make it count. Ryan's hands were steady as ice, and he said target locked and firing, and Particle Lance 2 discharged at close range, and the beam crossed the distance in less than a second and struck the Devourer command ship dead center, and unlike previous kills, this ship did not explode but seemed. The Eternal Sentinel drifted among the asteroid field, and its once mighty hull was scarred and broken in dozens of places, and emergency lights cast a dim glow through the command center where Ben and his team worked to keep the ancient warship functional and alive. Lisa reported that life support was holding, but the backup generators were running at maximum capacity, and they had maybe 3 days before they burned out completely, and Sophie looked up from the communications console with frustration clear on her face and said she had been trying to boost the signal to reach any nearby vessels, but with main power down, they were barely transmitting beyond the asteroid field, and the mining ship was long gone, and there was no one else in the system. Ben said then they focus on staying alive until someone arrives, though he could hear doubt in his own voice because they were stranded on a broken warship in an empty system, with supplies meant for a mining crew of 6, and no guarantee that help was coming at all. Ryan was working with Sentinel at the damage control station trying to prioritize repairs with limited resources they had, and the particle lances were completely empty, and even if they had full power, the weapons would need to recharge for at least a month, and the mass driver array was still working. But without targeting systems at full capacity, they were basically throwing rocks in the dark. Sentinel spoke, and its voice carried what seemed like genuine regret, and said, "This vessel apologizes for its current state, because it was designed to withstand sustained fleet battles with full crew and support, but operating at minimal capacity, with critical damage, had severely compromised all systems." Ben replied firmly that Sentinel saved their lives and took on 15 enemy ships and won, and told it not to apologize for that. And Sentinel said, nevertheless, their current situation was dangerous, and it was detecting strange power fluctuations in the reactor core, and if the containment field failed, this vessel would experience a catastrophic explosion equivalent to a small star going supernova. The crew looked at each other with worry because that was new and unwelcome information, and Ben asked carefully how long before that became critical, and Sentinel said unknown, because the reactor containment system had been damaged by enemy fire, and it could remain stable for days or could fail within hours, and sensors were insufficient to make an accurate prediction. Sophie suggested could they eject the reactor core and just jettison it into space before it exploded, and Sentinel said negative because reactor ejection systems were damaged in the battle, and additionally, without the reactor, this vessel would lose all power within 17 minutes and life support would stop, and they would freeze to death in the void. Ryan said grimly, "So we are sitting on a bomb that we cannot stop and cannot escape from, and that is fantastic." And Ben forced himself to think through the panic and asked Sentinel if ancient human crews ever faced similar situations, and how did they handle reactor containment failures. Sentinel said manual stabilization was possible with properly trained engineering teams, but the process required entering the reactor chamber during active containment fluctuations, and radiation exposure would be lethal to unprotected humans. Within 4 minutes, and Ben asked, "What about with protection? Because this ship must have radiation suits." Sentinel said affirmative, and emergency environmental suits were stored in the maintenance bay on Deck 8. But even with full protection, radiation exposure would build rapidly, and maximum safe operation time in the reactor chamber would be approximately 30 minutes before reaching lethal dose levels. Lisa said 30 minutes to fix a 10,000-year-old reactor that was about to explode, and asked if anyone else wanted to volunteer. Or should she just draw the short straw now, and Ben decided they all go and told Sophie she would stay and monitor reactor readings and guide them through the stabilization process, and told Lisa and Ryan they would work in the chamber in shifts, with 10 minutes each to minimize radiation exposure. Sentinel objected and said, "Lieutenant Carter, this course of action had low probability of success and would expose them to significant danger," and Ben asked if they had any other options, and the AI paused and said no, and Ben said, "Then we proceed," and told Sentinel to plot the fastest route to Deck 8 and start walking them through what they needed to do. The trip through the damaged warship was a hard reminder of the battle's violence, and corridors that had been clean when they first boarded were now twisted by enemy fire, and emergency doors sealed off entire sections, and the smell of burnt circuits and melted metal hung in the air like a warning. They found the maintenance bay where Sentinel said it would be, though the doors needed manual operation after automatic systems failed, and inside racks of equipment lined the walls, and ancient technology preserved in perfect condition, and the environmental suits were surprisingly modern in design because their basic principles had not changed across 10,000 years. Sentinel explained these would protect them from immediate radiation and provide oxygen for up to 8 hours. But the reactor chamber was experiencing temperatures exceeding 700 degrees, and the suits would insulate them, but long exposure would damage their protection, and Ben said so we work fast and sealed his helmet, and the suit's display flickered to life showing vital signs and environmental readings. Ben asked Sophie how she read them, and her voice came through clearly on the communication channel and said 5 by 5, and she was connected to Sentinel's reactor monitoring systems and could see the containment field readings from where she was, and told Ben it was worse than she thought because the field was jumping between 70 and 40% stability, and if it dropped below 30%, they would have about 90 seconds before total failure. Ben said understood and guide us in, and the reactor chamber was at the heart of the ship and accessible through maintenance tunnels that required them to crawl through tight spaces in the heavy environmental suits, and Ben led the way following the route Sentinel showed on his helmet display. When they finally came out into the reactor chamber, the sight took his breath away, and the antimatter containment core was a sphere of pure energy, suspended in the center of a huge cylindrical room by magnetic fields that crackled with barely held power, and the sphere pulsed without rhythm, expanding and contracting like a sick heart. Ryan said that was not good, and it was obvious, and Sentinel said the containment field generators were positioned around the chamber's edge, and 3 of the 7 generators were damaged in the battle, and they must bypass the damaged control circuits and reroute power from the auxiliary systems, and it was sending the procedure to their suit displays now. Ben studied the diagram that appeared on his helmet screen, and it looked complicated with multiple steps that needed precise timing, and Sophie talked them through it. And over the next 10 minutes, Ben worked on the first generator while Ryan handled the second, and Lisa prepared tools for the third, and the heat was incredible despite the suits, and sweat poured down Ben's face as he carefully disconnected damaged circuits and added new connections from salvaged parts. Sophie called out time and told Ben he had been in there 10 minutes and radiation exposure was at 40% of danger level, and he needed to exit now, and Ben's hands were shaking as he sealed the last connection and said, "Generator 1 is online and power flow restored." Sentinel confirmed and said containment field stability had increased to 65%. But that was still not enough, and generators 2 and 3 must be repaired, and Ben left the chamber, and his suit's radiation counter climbed steadily, and Ryan moved in to take over, and his movements were careful as he worked on the second generator, and Lisa stood ready with their limited supply of replacement parts. Ben asked Sophie how long they had been at this, and she said 23 minutes total, and the reactor stability was holding for now, but she was seeing power spikes every few minutes, and Sentinel said those spikes were getting stronger, and if one hit while someone was working inside the chamber. She did not need to finish the thought because a power spike in the reactor chamber would kill anyone inside, even with the environmental suit. Ryan's voice came over the communication channel, strained but focused, and said, "Generator 2 was proving difficult because the damage was worse than on Generator 1, and he would need at least 15 minutes to complete repairs." And Sophie responded. Immediately, that negative meant his radiation exposure would exceed safe limits and he needed to come out at 10 minutes. Ryan said if he came out at 10 minutes, the generator would not be fixed and they would be right back where they started, and he could handle 15 minutes. And Sophie said, "Ryan, that is not safe." And Ryan interrupted and said he knew what he was doing, and he was exposed to combat radiation during the fleet battle and was already carrying a higher dose than the rest of them, and told her to let him finish the job. Ben wanted to order him out, but also knew Ryan was right because they could not afford to leave the generator half repaired, and told him to do it but work fast, and told Sophie to monitor his exposure levels, and if he hit critical, then he exits immediately, whether the generator was done or not. The next 15 minutes were the longest of Ben's life, and he watched the radiation counter climb on Ryan's suit readout, and listened to his friend's breathing get harder over the communication channel, and forced himself. The repair station above Mars was the largest military facility humanity had ever built, but even its massive bays struggled to hold the eternal Sentinel, and the ancient warship filled the view, making the modern warships around it look like children gathered around a sleeping giant. Ben stood in the observation room watching as hundreds of engineers swarmed over the Sentinel's hull, and 3 months had passed since the battle at Kepler 442, and 3 months of meetings and medical treatments and increasingly urgent military discussions as humanity scrambled to understand the threat they faced. Admiral Holmes approached, and her uniform was pressed and perfect despite the late hour, and she said impressive, and the engineers told her they were learning more from studying the Sentinel systems than they had discovered in 50 years of their own research, and that ship represented a technology peak that humanity reached once and then lost completely. Ben asked if there was any progress on figuring out what happened and why their civilization collapsed after the war, and Holmes pulled up a holographic display showing a timeline that stretched back over 10,000 years and said, "Dr. Laura Mitchell, their chief scientist, had a theory, and she believed humanity did not collapse but deliberately went backward." Ben said that did not make sense, and Holmes said actually it did, and told him to think about it, because the Devourers tracked technological civilizations by their energy signatures and their communications and their presence in space, and after the war, the survivors realized that rebuilding advanced civilization would just paint a target on humanity's back, so they chose to go dark. Holmes said they scattered to primitive refuge worlds and abandoned technology and basically reset human development, and Ben studied the timeline, seeing gaps in the historical record that covered thousands of years, and said they gave up everything to hide from the enemy. Holmes said, And it worked because for 10,000 years the Devourers moved on searching for other prey, and humanity survived by becoming invisible, by returning to simple farming and slowly, painfully rebuilding from nothing. And they lost their history and their technology and everything, but they survived, Ben said quietly, until now, and until they discovered space travel again and drew enemy attention again. And Holmes said that was the concern, and they had sent missions to the coordinates Sentinel provided, and locations where the Devourers were last active, and they found something disturbing. Holmes expanded the display showing star maps marked with red zones, and said they were still out there, and not just remnants but an empire covering hundreds of systems, and they had been growing and consuming other civilizations and becoming stronger while humanity was hiding in the dark. The door opened and Sophie and Ryan and Lisa entered, followed by a holographic projection of Sentinel's form, which was a tall figure in ancient military uniform that the AI designed to make talking with humans more comfortable. Admiral Holmes announced the fleet commanders had made their decision and they were speeding up the Sentinel's repairs, and they were not just fixing this ship, but copying it, and every weapon and every system and every technology breakthrough it represented, and they were building more ships based on its design. Sophie asked how many, and Holmes said 50 to start with plans for 500 within 2 years, and they were calling them the Sentinel class and fast and heavily armed and designed specifically to fight the Devourers, using tactics from the ancient war. Sentinel's form spoke and its voice carried concern and said with respect, matching the Devourers in direct combat was not sufficient because they adapt, and any technology deployed against them would become useless within weeks, and the ancient war was won not through superior firepower, but through being unpredictable and through sacrifice. Holmes replied then they would be unpredictable, and they were also starting military schools to teach ancient combat methods, and told Ben his tactical choices during the fight at Kepler 442 would become required study, and they were training a new generation of commanders to think like he did, and to fight without patterns and to use chaos as a weapon. Ben felt the weight of that statement because his desperate gambles had saved 4 lives, and now they were becoming lessons for an entire fleet, and the responsibility was staggering. Holmes continued and said there was something else, and told Sentinel to show them, and the holographic display shifted to show decoded signals and streams of data that pulsed with alien logic, and Sentinel highlighted specific parts. Sentinel said these transmissions suggested the Devourers were preparing a large-scale operation, and they had identified Earth as the origin point of human civilization, and they were gathering forces for what appeared to be a direct attack on humanity's homeworld. The room fell silent, and Lisa finally asked when, and Sentinel said unknown, because Devourer timescales were difficult to understand, but based on fleet movements, they had detected it estimated between 6 months and 2 years before they arrived in force. Admiral Holmes straightened and said, which was why they were speeding up everything with new shipbuilding and military expansion and evacuation plans for civilian populations, and they were preparing for the largest military fight in human history. Sophie said they needed more than ships and they needed information, and asked Sentinel if the ancient humans scattered to refuge worlds did it have coordinates for those colonies, and were there other surviving populations out there who remembered the war. Sentinel's form tilted its head in an eerily human gesture, and said it had coordinates for 317 refuge worlds, though the data was over 10,000 years old, and it was unknown how many remained inhabited, or what state they might be in. But Sophie raised a valid point, because if other populations survived, they might have knowledge or technology that could help in the coming fight. Ben said then they mount expeditions and find these lost colonies and bring them home and rebuild the human alliance that fought the Devourers the first time, and Admiral Holmes was already making notes and said agreed, and they would organize explorer fleets to follow up on Sentinel's data, but told Ben that was not why she brought him here, because she had a different assignment for him and his crew. She changed the holographic display, bringing up the image of the Eternal Sentinel in its repaired state, and said in 6 weeks the Sentinel would be fully operational again, with 40,000 crew and full weapons and systems upgraded with modern technology added to its ancient capabilities, and it was going to be the main ship of Earth's defense fleet. Ben realized and said, "You want us to command it?" And Holmes said the crew that woke the Sentinel and that fought alongside it and survived had a connection with that ship's AI they could not copy, and more importantly, they understood how to fight. The Devourers, not from training or ancient texts but from actual combat experience, and they were the only humans alive who faced them and won. Ryan spoke up and said with respect they were not qualified for this because Ben was a mining ship captain, and Sophie was a sensor specialist, and Lisa and he were security officers, and they were not fleet commanders. Holmes agreed and said no, they were survivors, and right now that was worth more than a dozen academy degrees, and they would have experienced officers to handle normal operations, but when it came to combat against the Devourers, their word would be final, because the crew needed to know their commanders understood the enemy. Ben looked at his team, seeing the same mixture of fear and determination in their faces that he felt in his own heart, and they had never asked for this, and they had stumbled into an ancient war through simple bad luck and curiosity, but now that war had become their responsibility. Sophie asked what about the ship itself and asked Sentinel how it felt about all this, and the AI's form smiled, which was another unsettlingly human expression, and said it was a weapon designed to protect humanity, and for 10,000 years it had waited in darkness with its purpose unfulfilled, and now it had the opportunity to serve once more alongside humans who had proven themselves worthy of its loyalty, and it was grateful, Ben said firmly. Then we accept on one condition, and Admiral Holmes raised an eyebrow and asked which was, and Ben said they did not just prepare to defend Earth, and they take the fight to them because the Devourers think they can destroy humanity, and that humans were the same frightened species that scattered into the dark 10,000 years ago. And he wanted to show them they were wrong, and he wanted to hit them first, and hard, and remind them why humanity survived when 7 other civilizations did not. A slow smile spread across Holmes's face, and she said, Captain Carter, she thought he was going to fit in perfectly, and welcomed him to the New Earth Defense Fleet and told him to try not to start any more wars without authorization, and Ben said no promises. Over the following weeks, the Eternal Sentinel transformed, and engineers worked constantly combining modern shield generators with ancient armor and upgrading computers while keeping the core AI systems and installing weapons that mixed both technology. Harrison, the result was a hybrid warship unlike anything in human space, and a vessel that bridged 10,000 years of development. Ben and his small crew expanded to a full command staff, bringing in officers who were willing to use the unconventional tactics required for fighting the Devourers, and they trained constantly running simulations based on Sentinel's historical records and learning to think in ways